Welcome to our webinar on the SEN Review Green Paper, which has finally been published. The Green Paper outlines the proposals for what will become law around supporting children and young people with SEND. The webinar will also touch on the Schools White Paper, as the two are inevitably linked. Our webinar is based on an original presentation by our National Network of Parent Carer Forums, and we are presenting this in partnership with our neighbouring forums in Thurrock and Southend. So to give an overview of what's in the webinar, we'll be giving you a bit of background to the SEND review itself. We'll be talking about what's actually gone wrong in the SEND system, what the Green Paper proposes to fix the issues, summing up the main points and how you can get involved in providing feedback. So to give a bit of background to the SEND review itself, our National Network of Parent Carer Forums met with Nadeem Zahawi when he was Children's Minister back in 2019. They told him two main things are needed for SEND children: proper funding in the system and a cross-government approach to address the issues that are being experienced in the system. So in September 2019, the SEND review team was set up and it was led by Mike Davis. But then in November 2019 a general election was called and we entered into the period called PERDA, where nothing can happen in government until the new government is established. And in January 2020 the new government had a bit of a cabinet reshuffle, obviously, and we ended up with a new Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, and Vicky Ford, who is an Essex MP, was Children's Minister. Very shortly after that, obviously, COVID hit and all work stopped, other than obviously dealing with the pandemic. In spring of 21, it was expected to receive an interim report on the Schools White Paper, but that didn't actually happen, obviously because the tensions were elsewhere, and the Children's Social Care Review was announced, but still there was nothing happening really with the SEND review. In September 21, it was given a bit of a reboot. Certain organisations like the NMPCF and Special Needs Jungle, who sort of representing families of children with SEND, were actually asked to join the steering group for the SEND review team. And then at the same time there was another government reshuffle, and Nadeem Zahawi is now Secretary of State for Education, and Will Quince, another Essex MP, is Children's Minister. And then not that long ago now, the Green Paper was finally published. So it has been, you know, over 2.5 years in development, obviously with some lengthy period of where work was paused. But it was only in the last few months, since it was given the reboot last September, that organisations such as the NMPCF and Special Needs Jungle were actually asked to join the steering group. So they were more, you know, giving feedback and commenting on the proposals that had been developed rather than helping develop the proposals. So what's gone wrong in this SEND system? It's important to understand the background of how things have played out since 2014 before considering what's in the Green Paper. It's our families that have been living through it and have experienced the challenges. They were the right reforms, they were delivered in the wrong environment. The reforms were meant to mean that support was person-centred and not provision-led, and really prioritise the needs of children and young people. There was meant to be more joint working. You know, all government works in silos, whether it's national or local, across education, health or social care, but the Children and Families Act of 2014 was meant to result in better joint working. And co-production was meant to be at the heart of everything and not confrontation with families. But there's not enough money in the system, and the money that is in the system just wasn't being used effectively. There's no ring fencing of funds, and false economies are then pursued, and you end up in a vicious circle of trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. Schools aren't incentivised to be inclusive, and therefore they don't always do a really good, good enough job of supporting children and young people with SEND. So then education, health and care plans are sought to provide that support. The high needs budget then gets overspent, and local authorities end up having to take money from the school's budget, and the cycle just starts all over again. It's not helped with SEND, having been a low priority across health and social care. There is a lack of clarity over who provides certain support and who pays for which element. There's poor accountability and consequences. There's a real mismatch between responsibility, powers and accountability across the system. The local area SEND inspections tell you that. More local authorities have had a written statement of action than not, and still some don't make enough progress by the time of their revisit. Leaders, managers and staff haven't been equipped or really supported to deliver the reforms. There's not always a great understanding of the law. They haven't necessarily made the cultural changes that were going to be needed to successfully implement these reforms. And really, without a willingness to do SEND well, it's not going to happen. In 2019, only 40% of teachers said there's appropriate training in SEND for them, and that was even less than it had been a couple of years previously. Not sure what they'd say now. And there is still not enough co-production across the system, whether that's at a strategic level, deciding policies and developing services, or at the individual level, for example, with settings, working with individual children and their families. So what is the impact of all of this? Well, too many children with SEND in mainstream are still having a poor experience. Their needs are not identified and understood and met promptly. Families have no simple means of redress when things do not go right. EHCPs aren't well written, and the provision in them isn't always received. And when children and young people come to leave education, there is still that cliff edge. They might be leaving education later, but it just means that the cliff edge has moved. It's still happy, but it's still there. There are long waits for key health services. Whether you're talking first referral, diagnosis, and just, your ordinary ongoing care. And it's the same with children's social care. Getting a children's assessment or a carer's assessment in the first place, can be really, really tricky. And throughout this time, if you're not getting the right support, it means that the needs of your child or young person is escalating. There is late intervention in getting them the right support, and then resources are having to be diverted to intensive interventions and crisis management rather than focusing on the early intervention that would actually be of benefit. There is inconsistency in practice and provision throughout the country, and not just between local authorities, but especially within larger authorities like Essex, it's within those authorities. And if we look at Essex, not only do we cross borders with Hertfordshire and Suffolk, within our borders, we also have 2 unitary authorities in Thurrock and Southend, and a lot of our services do cross over, but we all receive different provision. So it leads to low parental confidence in the system, especially as, you know, the poor outcomes for our children and young people. 76% of children with SEND do not achieve their early learning goals. Only 22% reach expected standards at Key Stage 2, and their attainment scores at Key Stage 4, which is GCSE level, is a lot lower than for children without SEND. You know, actually staying in education or training or in employment beyond Key Stage 4, beyond the GCSE level, you know, is a lot lower again for children and young people with SEND than for those without. And for those children that end up in alternative provisions, their outcomes are even poorer. And our children are more likely to end up with a mental health disorder. So is it any wonder that we end up angry? That tribunals have increased significantly, you know, because our trust in the system and the services that are meant to support our children and young people is diminishing. And it's not just us that see. The problems are not us. We're not pushy parents. We're not asking for too much. Our children and young people have the same aspirations as all other children. You know, our expectations for them are not too high. Tribunals are not too powerful. They are applying the law. This is not a problem with our demand. This is a problem with supply. And if there was more joint working and local areas actually use their data properly so they could plan services better, and the services were co-produced with children and young people and families, then families would be getting the right services at the right time, and, you know, there would be no crisis. So our national network of parent care forums have said what needs to change is, you know, we do need minimum standards. You know, take the loose interpretation out and put some certainty in. You know, give clarity around, you know, how services should be jointly commissioned and who has responsibility for paying for which bit of, you know, the service or the support that's needed, you know, and hopefully it would stop our children being bounced around from service to service, and they'd actually get the support that they need. And it's crucial to really consider how money is allocated and spent, and, you know, ideally in some situations it means ring fencing the funds. You know, accountability is key. You know, use the inspection frameworks, you know, and use the data. There is an abundance of data. You know, what is it telling you about what people, you know, what children and young people actually need? And, you know, ultimately it's about the right people having the right knowledge and using the right skills to provide the right support. Now we come on to what exactly does the Green Paper propose? Ultimately, its aim is to deliver change for children, young people and their families, you know, by having a single SEND and alternative provision system. 82% of children in alternative provisions are identified with special educational needs. So it is very obvious they are interlinked, and there needs to be an integrated role for alternative provision within the system. You know, currently, alternative provision is increasingly being used to supplement the SEND system. It's providing SEND support as temporary placements whilst waiting for EHCPs, or because there's insufficient capacity in special schools. The way the system is at the moment, there is a lack of clarity over who does what, when and how it's paid for. So the Green Paper is proposing to tighten up accountability for processes and procedures with clear roles and responsibility, and a more consistent approach regarding funding. Less of, the band-aid fix that we end up with at the moment. And it aims to build on early and accurate identification of needs for high quality teaching and prompt access to targeted support, along with strong specialist provision, all underpinned by strong co-production and accountability at every level, with improved data collection so issues can be identified and addressed promptly. So with a single send and alternative provision system, there are new national standards which are pretty much a fundamental requirement, and at least that then means that the send code of practice is less likely to be open to interpretation, and obviously will need to be updated. There are local send partnerships that are proposed to be established, although the role for parents and carers is unclear at the moment. So unless that's actually set out in the national standards, we're going to end up with inconsistency on how well local areas work with parents and carers and children and young people to develop their plans and services. There is the proposal to standardise the EHCP process and template and turn everything very digital. So how will that work, and how accessible will it be? Because we already know there are areas that, where there is extreme digital poverty. So how will those families be able to access the system? And then the list of settings that parents can choose a placement from. Well, this is gaining, a lot of reaction and concern from parents and carers. The Green Paper doesn't really make it clear how this is going to work. And again, we could end up with a lot of local variation on how the lists are drawn up and what their function is. So that needs a lot more consideration. And the mandatory mediation is another area that is causing concern for parents and carers. How much will that delay the process where there isn't agreement? If you've got to go to mediation, how long is that going to mean that your child isn't getting the right support, which obviously is primary concern for parents and carers? And if you have to go to the mediation, are the decisions binding, and who's monitoring, that those decisions are being met, or their obligations are being met? An integrated role for alternative provisions within the local SEND system is welcome, and it clearly needs to happen. As we've talked about earlier in the webinar, financial stability is always a good thing when you are providing support for children and young people. And actually in Essex, the alternative provision contract does have a level of financial stability, as there is a specific budget and the contract is on a 3-year cycle. Can't speak for what happens in Thurrock and Southend. You would need to talk to your own parent carer forums to find out what happens in your area. The proposal for all alternative provisions to join a strong multi-academy trust, well, it will remain to be seen what difference that will actually make, because we all know that some trusts You know, they get it. With children with additional needs, others really don't. So that one could go either way, really, couldn't it? The performance framework for alternative provisions to work towards, well, yes, obviously that can be a good idea, but what does it actually look like? So again, the devil is in the detail. Greater oversight and transparency around pupil movements. Well, that's a positive, because, you know, children and young people need stability, and it shouldn't be a case of out of sight, out of mind for the referring school once they've placed a child in an alternative provision. And who knows, by having robust oversight of what happens, you know, we can gather data on, you know, repeated pupil movements, you know, those where they are, you know, they are moved from one alternative provision to another, perhaps, you know, and help build a fuller picture of how alternative provisions are being used. And they are launching a call for evidence on the use of unregistered provision. There can be a place for unregistered provision. They can sometimes offer a greater flexibility in approach, which some of our children do need. But again, perhaps there needs to be a better understanding of why unregistered provision is used. You know, who is it more likely to be used for, and a better understanding of the outcomes in the children and young people that are placed in the unregistered provisions. So the Green Paper proposes to deliver clarity on the roles and responsibilities for every partner across education, health and social care. Local government has a clear role to play and will be equipped with levers to fulfil their responsibilities. Well, great, because currently it's a mess. And, you know, the roles and responsibilities been a little bit too open to interpretation, haven't necessarily had the buy-in from health and social care, and school leaders are driven by attendance and exam results and not focused on inclusion. But the Green Paper doesn't quite provide enough detail on the accountability, and that's critical. There are lots of words, but not many specifics. You know, for example, we therefore propose to strengthen accountabilities through a range of measures. But there is no indication really of what those measures might be. And it's not also just about accountability. You know, there needs to be incentives. People actually need to buy into being inclusive. So what are the incentives going to be to encourage services to be inclusive? You know, there needs to be a little bit more detail about how all this will work. And the new regions group, I mean, that is actually detailed a little bit more in the schools white paper, but there is clear recognition that the current regional school commissioners are not fit for purpose. I mean, they were originally set up to be commissioners and were the conduit to the money for academies, but then they were asked to perform a regulatory role that they weren't really equipped to do. So it'll be important to understand what the powers of the new regions group will be. The providing statutory guidance to integrated care boards about their responsibilities regarding SEND, well, that's quite welcome, and it's actually in the recent Health and Care Act. So it has, you know, SEND has been a low priority, but it's good to see it's changing and things, you know, should be tightened up. A national network, well, national framework for banding and price tariffs. Most local authorities do already operate a banding framework for their EHCPs. What is crucial is that the funding behind the bandings is sufficient to actually meet the needs that are described within those bandings. and it means that by having a national framework, there would be less autonomy on local authorities for setting their own bandings. In Essex, there is a new framework that has been developed and will be being rolled out across Essex. We've actually produced a guide to explain what's happening. We're waiting for clarification on one point before we can release that for families to understand, what the changes might be. The price tariffs for schools, this is a new one, and some placements or some children need very bespoke placements, and they are going to and therefore expensive placements, and so it's critical that these aren't actually priced out of the market if that is what some children do need. And the new local area SEND inspection framework, well, that has now been published. Haven't had time to review that as yet, but as a network we gave feedback on the draft some time ago now, and the steering group for the NMPCF have actually worked with the Department for Education and the CQC to develop that framework. How successful the changes proposed will be is in part dependent on how well they are implemented and how much consideration is given to how they will be implemented. There was very little focus on implementation in the 2014 reforms, but the system at the moment is very unstable in parts, so it does need, so we can't really wait for the new system, the SEM reforms Mark II, it has to be addressed now. There is the safety valve programme, which is available to those local authorities that are really struggling. It's mainly those where the high needs budget is overspent, which isn't the case in our local areas, but it is the case elsewhere in the country. Obviously, national standards needs to be developed with the system, and that should also include, children and young people and parents and carers. That is a positive. And the actual delivery programme for the changes, again, this is quite critical, but there is no detail on that at the moment. We don't quite know how that's going to look. I mean, obviously it's needed. These are the right steps, but the detail is missing. Going to step away from the green paper now and have a bit of a focus on the school's white paper. And, this is what will create the environment in schools that the new SEM reforms will have to work within. The school's white paper is setting the accountability for schools. So all schools must be in the process of joining a strong multi-academy trust by 2030. So it's positive that the word inclusive is in the definition of a strong multi-academy trust, but what difference is that actually going to make for our children? There are, as we've said, some trusts that get it and others that don't. There's a new target of 90% of pupils must meet the expected standard of reading, writing and maths at Key Stage 2. So what does this mean when the fact is that 15% of pupils have special educational needs? So on the one hand, if schools have to ensure that 90% of their school population reach the expected standard, then they will need to provide really effective support for their SEND pupils to get near that target. On the other hand, it could equally mean that schools will just continue to be exclusive of children with SEND because it will be easier for them to reach their 90% target without those children. So how is this going to be avoided? We don't know. The parent pledge that schools will provide evidence-based support if a child falls behind in English and maths. What evidence-based support is it? Because it can't just be academic when it comes to our children. Our children, you know, quite often need a very different type of support in order to reach their potential. You know, support such as speech and language therapy, mental health support. You know, is this the extra support that is referred to here? And the same goes for the tutoring courses. You know, does that, you know, include targeted and specialist support or specialist tutoring that our children will need? The white paper also focuses on better behaviour and higher attendance through more effective use of data. And this part of the white paper is attracting huge levels of concern amongst our parents. You know, if the measures are too punitive, or the consequences are too punitive, then it won't encourage schools to be inclusive. Children and young people with emotionally based school avoidance, more often than not, have unmet SEND needs. What they don't need is to be harshly punished for not being able to attend school. You know, and we've already covered that 82% of children and young people in alternative provisions are identified with SEND. So this, you know, really seems to be the biggest area where the two pieces of legislation, you know, are going to be at odds with one another. So it is a real concern. And the new arm's length curriculum body that's within this, you know, how will SEND needs be represented within the new body? You know, we really need to find that out. To sum up the positives, the national standards, if they're implemented properly, there is no dispute over who's entitled to what, and it's clear for settings as well, and that should drive early intervention. If there is clarity over who pays and what for, then that helps local areas plan the services that are going to be needed. And this presumably is the thinking behind mandatory mediation, is that it should be really straightforward. If everybody's entitlements and responsibilities are clear, then mediation is easy, and there is then the reduction in the need to go to tribunals. There is obviously a lot of scepticism about how this will actually be achieved. There are things within the Green Paper where there is such a level of uncertainty over how it's actually going to work, and the detail is missing, that they are a concern. Naming a setting from a tailored list. We need to know more about these lists and who's drawing them up and what settings are on there and how the settings are decided upon. And what happens, you know, if there is a disagreement over whether any of the settings are suitable. And that brings on to, you know, the new redress process. You know, how does that go into work? Is there going to be mandatory mediation for absolutely every disagreement? Are the decisions going to be binding? Who is going to be monitoring that the recommendations are being implemented? And how does that affect, you know, how tribunals are accessed? The national framework for bandings and price tariffs. It's crucial that the funding behind the bandings are sufficient to meet the needs described within the bandings, but also the price tariffs for placements. What happens to those placements that are, quite rightly expensive because of the level of support that a child or young person needs. What will happen to those placements? What are the expectations around health and social care contributions? How are they going to be calculated? There isn't a lot in the Green Paper around health and social care. The new integrated care system is now being implemented within the NHS. The Children's Social Care Review has been published. This was an ideal opportunity to tie, this all together a little bit more, and it is still lacking. And how does all this fit together, especially with the school's white paper and the roles and responsibilities and the accountabilities for all partners across the system? The detail there is missing. And there doesn't seem to be enough about the wider outcomes for children and young people. There will be significant numbers of children and young people who aren't going on to further education or employment, but there's very little detail about what the alternative options might be for those children and young people, and what support would be needed for those children and young people. And the more holistic outcomes, such as independent living and community inclusion, seem to be missing. And again, the support that our children and young people will need, to achieve those aspirations, because, those aspirations are the same as children and young people without SEND, but our children just need more support in order to get there. And we cannot ignore the bigger context into which these reforms are going to have to be delivered. The big picture for SEND improvement cannot be lost. With the schools bills, are school leaders going to be concerned about doing inclusion well, or more focused on how they keep their attainment stats up and their attendance and behaviour records near perfect, all of which are risk factors for our children? It's the same with health and social care. Are the NHS teams going to be more focused on their new structure and where they fit within it? Children's Social Care Review is actually now out, and if you look at the executive summary, at the very least, there isn't one mention of children with disabilities within that. And if you read the entire report, the focus is very much around the system, around child protection and looked after children, and no real focus, or no specific focus on children with disabilities. Implementation is going to be key, and there is recognition of that this time, but there is not enough detail, and we can't wait another 5 years for the reforms. The system is in crisis now, and in a way we are fortunate in our local areas in Essex, Southend and Thurrock that they've all had their local area SEND inspections, were all given written statement of actions, they've all had their revisits, although we're still waiting for the results of that in Essex. But our local systems have already started on their improvement journey. There's no denying there is still a long way to go, but at least they've started, unlike in some local areas. Under the NHS's new integrated care system, our 3 areas are going to have to be more joined up. And, as Parent Carer Forums, although we're part of the eastern region of Parent Carer Forums, we've now created an Essex Alliance within that to ensure that we are working together as one strong voice, certainly on the health side. you know, it seemed important to us to stick together. As a PCF, Essex Family Forum have been established for a few years now. Thurrock and Southend were trying to establish themselves during COVID, you know, the most challenging period of our generation. So by combining forces, we're much stronger, and hopefully we'll be able to achieve better outcomes for our children and young people. Out of interest, if you wanted to look at what help is available for local areas outside of the SEND inspections, especially where the high needs block is severely in the red, that is available on YouTube. The Department of Education have produced a webinar for the NMPCF, so you can access that. We need you to get involved in providing feedback on the green paper. It's critical that as many parents and carers respond to that consultation as possible. You can complete the NMPCF survey that's been created for parents and carers. They realised that not everyone is going to be able to respond to the DFE consultation questions. They are asking for very detailed responses, and some of them do assume quite an in-depth degree of understanding of the ins and outs of the entire SEND system. You know, one of the early questions in the consultation is, what factors would enable local authorities to successfully commission provision for low incidence, high cost need and further education across local authority boundaries? You know, most people, most lay people, for want of a better expression, aren't going to be able to answer that. You know, even we're struggling as to what exactly that question is asking. So how they expect, you know, a parent carer who just wants their child to receive the right provision at the right time to be able to answer that, you know, is beyond us. So our national network has designed a survey for individual parents and carers to complete. And it shouldn't take very long. There's a lot of multiple choice questions in there. So it's really far more appropriate for parents and carers to complete. Shouldn't take long, as I've said. We're going to really be promoting this week. So please share our post with any other parents and carers that you know. And the NMPCF will then collate all the responses that they get to present to the DFE as part of a collective response from parents and carers. You can use the QR code, you can follow the link, but you do need to bear in mind that the closing date for this particular survey is the 30th of June. The overall consultation finishes on the 22nd of July, but the NMPCF are obviously closing theirs on the 30th of June because they've got to collate responses from parents and carers across 152 local authorities before they can submit the collective response to the DFE. So please get sharing, get completing. You know, if you're feeling, you know, that you can complete the DFE consultation questions, then do so. We are uploading the questions to our website so that you can view them in advance and think about, you know, how you might respond. We would suggest that if there are questions that perhaps, you know, you don't feel equipped to answer, then put that as your answer so that you can move on to the next question. You know, put that as, I do not feel equipped to answer this question. And then you can move on to the next one and find questions that you are confident in our answering. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen, or if you've just skipped through and read the slides, then all well and good, you know, but yeah, do get on and leave your feedback on the green paper, whichever way you see fit. Thank you.